New York City, a city with an easy-to-understand grid system. Traffic crisscrossing at perpendicular intersections. A big park in the shape of a rectangle whose name is pretty easy to remember. So the geography of the city is pretty easy to comprehend, right? Well, actually, New York City's geography is pretty weird. And here are a few examples. Let's start with what the city is mainly known for, Manhattan. And if I told you to name the easternmost point of the island, where would you name it? Well, your first guess might be in the Lower East Side, but that is wrong. In fact, the picture I showed you here is wrong. Manhattan is located on a tilt, and this makes the answer more interesting. And the answer is not on the east side of Manhattan, but on the west side of Manhattan here in Inwood. Again, since we are tilted southwest to northeast, the northernmost neighborhood will also be the easternmost neighborhood, and that just happens to be in Inwood. The tilt also makes some interesting quirks. For example, the westernmost and easternmost bridges are all on the eastern coast of Manhattan. The easternmost bridge is the Broadway Bridge on the northeastern coast of Manhattan, but the westernmost bridge is actually the Brooklyn Bridge. At first, this sounds pretty dumb, but if you look at a map, the bridge is actually the westernmost bridge in all of Manhattan. It probably doesn't help that almost all of the Hudson River crossings are tunnels, and the only bridge on the western coast of Manhattan is the George Washington Bridge, about 12 miles north of the Brooklyn Bridge. And to mess with your head a little, I am going to list Manhattan neighborhoods that are about the same longitude, but don't appear so. The Upper West Side is on the same longitude as the Lower East Side. Hudson Yards is on the same longitude as the Financial District. Chinatown is on the same longitude as Midtown West. Yorkville is on the same longitude as Harlem. And East Harlem is on the same longitude as Inwood. But the entire time, I lied. This is not Manhattan. This is Manhattan. Manhattan includes Roosevelt Island, Randall's Island, Governor's Island, Liberty Island, and Marble Hill. Yes, Marble Hill is part of Manhattan, even though at first glance, it looks like it is part of the Bronx. This is because Marble Hill used to be connected to Manhattan. But in the 1800s, New York City wanted to straighten the Harlem River so that ships could easily navigate it. So they dug right through Marble Hill for the new canal. But the canal became too narrow once ship traffic increased. So New York City widened the canal in the late 1800s. Finally, in 1914, New York City filled in the old river route so that Marble Hill is physically part of the Bronx, but is under the jurisdiction of Manhattan. This also means that Marble Hill is the easternmost point in Manhattan. And yes, it is more east than Randall's Island, but just barely. But now that we talked about the easternmost point of Manhattan, let's talk about the westernmost point of Manhattan. Liberty Island and Ellis Island are under the jurisdiction of Manhattan, so yes, the westernmost point of Manhattan would be in those two islands. But it is especially weird for Ellis Island, where the westernmost point for New York City is right here and not on the coastline. Why is that? Well, Ellis Island used to be much smaller, and in the 1800s, Ellis Island was expanded. But it used dirt from New Jersey to do so, and New Jersey later sued New York, as New Jersey claimed Ellis Island was theirs. In the end, it was settled. What was Ellis Island before the expansion was under New York territory, and what was the expanded portion is now New Jersey's territory. This means that you can technically walk from New York City to New Jersey if you travel to Ellis Island. And speaking of weird borders, let's talk about the border between Queens and Brooklyn. You see, unlike other boroughs where a body of water separates them, Brooklyn and Queens are separated by land. But with a grid system, you'd think it would be easy to figure out where the border is, right? But the geography and history of New York City is so whack that it doesn't allow for it, and we are left with this monstrosity, where the border skirts streets and divides neighborhoods. To illustrate how weird the border is, Halsey Street on the L train is located both in Queens and Brooklyn. The southbound platform is located in Brooklyn, while the northbound platform is located in Queens. So, why was the border drawn this way? Well, the border has a very long history. Back in the 1700s, New York City was different. The town of Bushwick, now Brooklyn, was occupied by the Dutch. while the town of Newtown, now Queens, was occupied by the English. The Dutch and the English frequently disagreed on where the border was, and it caused big problems, to the point where men from both sides stoned each other. So in 1768, a bill was passed, creating a definitive border. It was measured from a huge rock called Arbitration Rock, as there was no grid system yet, and borders were measured by natural objects. Anything southwest of the rock was Brooklyn, and anything northeast of the rock was Queens. That border was solidified in 1880, when the government sent professional surveyors to more accurately draw the border from Arbitration Rock. Except this was when the grid system was implemented in both Queens and Brooklyn, and with new elevated trains, the development was even greater. This caused problems, as since the border wasn't aligned to the grid system, the border sliced through people's homes. Imagine you sleep in Brooklyn and you wake up and brush your teeth in Queens, all in the same house. That was problematic, especially when Brooklyn and Queens were not unified into New York City we know today. This means you have no idea which county you owe taxes to, who your representative was, and so on. So in 1931, New York City gave up Arbitration Rock as its dividing line and settled with the current border. And that border still causes issues, like in 2012, where artists were denied access to the Brooklyn Museum's studio project because although the artists were from Bushwick, they had Queens zip codes. While we're in Queens, let's talk about it. Queens is New York City's biggest borough. Claiming a mighty 109 square miles, it is almost twice the size of the next biggest borough, Brooklyn. But I don't think people appreciate how massive Queens is. For example, here is Manhattan, and you can fit the entirety of Manhattan into Queens with room to spare. But that just scratches the surface of the true scale of the borough. Queens is actually more south than Brooklyn. Well, how can that be? Brooklyn is directly south of Queens, but actually, Queens doesn't just stretch from east to west, but also to the south. Welcome to the Rockaways, and the Rockaways are extremely disconnected from the rest of Queens. In fact, the center of the Rockaways is closer to Nassau County than it is to the center of Queens. But Breezy Point in the Rockaways is pretty much the most disconnected of the disconnected, as it is located extremely far west of the Rockaways. And since the Rockaways is also located on a tilt, Breezy Point is more south than Brooklyn. And to finalize this concept, this point in Breezy Point is also the furthest south you can get in Long Island. This also means that if you drew a line from Breezy Point to Fort Totten, the northeasternmost point in Queens, and put it on Queens' eastern end, the line would stretch past Nassau County and into Suffolk County, which means that it is easier to get to Suffolk County from eastern Queens than it is to get from one end of Queens to another. And finally, we can't forget that Flushing Avenue doesn't go to Flushing. Let's now go to Staten Island, and everyone likes to joke how isolated Staten Island is and how New Yorkers don't view Staten Island as New York City. But Staten Island is pretty isolated in comparison to the rest of New York City. The center of Staten Island is approximately here, and if you drew a straight line to both New Jersey and Brooklyn, the closest borough to Staten Island, the line would hit New Jersey before hitting Brooklyn. This means that Staten Island is closer to another state than it is to the rest of New York City. Another way to show how disconnected Staten Island is, let's take the center of Staten Island and draw a line to the center of New York City, here in Bushwick. The distance measures to be 14 miles. This means the distance between the centers of Staten Island and New York City exceeds that of the length of Manhattan. Manhattan is already a pretty long island, as it takes about an hour on the one train to make that distance. So knowing that Staten Island is even further than that should tell you the true isolation of Staten Island. And finally, let's take the southernmost point of Staten Island and draw a line to the northernmost point in the Bronx. Let's then reposition this line in a southwest direction on Staten Island's southern tip, and you will see that the line goes past New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. This means that from the southern tip of Staten Island, it is easier to cross the entirety of another state than it is to go to the other end of New York City. And yeah, this marks the end of this video. What surprised you the most from this video? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing. And I'll see you in the next video.